that what Tony Abbott said there, when he talks about the kind of the creeping growth of the welcome to country question, and also, the whole sort of effort that seems to be out there to rename, remake, almost sort of delegitimize post-settlement Australia and say there was a sort of Edenic world and everything that's come after that is terrible. That's driving, I think, an awful lot of people away because, again, you want to keep this, like the PM, want to keep this to this very narrow sort of question, but people, even if they're not up to date on the way the legislation works and the way the Senate works and the crossbench and everything else that Hollie just told us, they're concerned. They see the direction things are going, and they worry that this opens the door to a more sort of activist class to remake society. Why wouldn't they vote no on that?
I can completely understand how people see these sort of things and hear these sort of things, and it makes them very worried. I find it often very nauseating hearing the constant platitudes, which are effectively symbolic and absolutely nothing else. Like people getting up at every place they go to and acknowledge the Aboriginal traditional owners of the land. Well, they never give the traditional owners any rent, any money, any fee for actually appearing. It looks to me like we're at the headquarters of PricewaterhouseCoopers in Sydney CBD, but no, they're apparently it's owned by somebody else. So yes, that kind of empty symbolism frustrates me too, and I think there should be greater scrutiny of Aboriginal organisations. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But again, this is precisely the sort of thing that the Voice is designed to stop, not to further. The problem is there already is, if you like, a Canberra Voice. That is the business as usual we have already. There already are these organisations that you might argue, I haven't looked into it, but you might argue it, are not delivering. Certainly the fact that the gap is as strong and long as it is would indicate that whatever is happening now is not working. So again, you can keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, or you can try something new. And again, just to go back to that conversation we were having earlier, the whole point of not legislating a specific model and then enshrining that in the Constitution is exactly to avoid the sort of consequences that Hollie and other people are worried about, which is if it doesn't work or if it works for a certain amount of time and then it gets taken
away. But Hollie, so the question is, you also,
because they want something practical.
I want to go to Hollie on this. I want to go to Hollie on this.
Why not just something in the preamble and legislation?
Because the whole...
Sorry, James.
No, I was going to say, because, the point he brings up here, though, it goes to the very heart of this issue to me. They say, governments aren't listening. Labor's in power. There's nothing statutorily or in the Constitution that's saying you're not allowed to listen to Aboriginal people. At Garma the other day, the Prime Minister said, hey, I'm surrounded by all these things that happen when you listen, so why can't, Hollie Hughes, the government simply listen and act rather than dividing the country through this entire constitutional issue?
Look, I am going to send both of you my speech, and for anyone watching at home, it's on my Hollie Hughes YouTube channel and my Facebook and Instagram. But these were exactly the points that I was making tonight and in the chamber. But quite frankly, Linda Burney gets up time after time after time, almost tears in her eyes, and we need the Voice to close the gap. You know what, Linda? We don't. You are the Minister for Indigenous Affairs.
Correct.
If you know there's a problem, what are you doing today? What have you been doing for the past 16 months? And if you've been sitting on your hands campaigning for a constitutional change and not reviewing Indigenous organisations, not talking to local communities about what actually could make a difference to their life other than pushing the Voice down their throats, what has she been doing for the past 16 months? What has she been doing and what has made a difference to Indigenous communities? I can tell you it's a big fat, and I think it's criminally negligible.
But Hollie, what did the government do for the last 10 years it was in power? How did it not have this idea?
In this country?
If
you're just yelling at me now, and I'm not in the studio, and
enough
I can't
yelling. Enough yelling. We're gonna let's call time.
If these ALC,
ladies and gentlemen, we're calling time on the Voice discussion
here. Why did the government look into them for the 10 years it was in power?
I just like the way you say Hollie.
Hollie. I'm an American, Hollie. Hollie Hughes and Joe Hildebrand are here on Paul Murray Live with the American. But let's move on here, away from the Voice here, because there's more lefty politics. Praise be. Hallelujah. Let's talk about housing. And Joe, I want to ask you about this here, because I've been fascinated by the Greens and the way they have been very cannily playing a really interesting game here, splitting Labour over this whole issue of housing. The Labor is being squeezed by the Greens over renters' rights and also this Housing Affordability Future Fund, which to me seems like the biggest scam in the world. But have a look at this here.
The only way we're going to sustainably bring down rents is to increase supply. That's going to take rezoning and unlocking of land from state Labor governments. If Anthony Albanese can't get his mates to do this without calling a national cabinet, I don't know what he's been doing for the last few months. It's not as if this is a new problem.
Just a couple of days ago, the Prime Minister was out boasting that he was confident that he could get all the state and territory premiers to sign on to a new public holidays if the Matildas get to the finals of the World Cup. If the Prime Minister is able to do that, then he should be able to coordinate a rent freeze across states and territories.
All right, not quite the grab I expected, but Joe Hildebrand, coming at this from somebody who's, shall we say, a friend of Labor. The Housing Australia Future Fund is this idea where you take a bunch of money and punt it on the market, and then you use that a few years from now to build houses at improbably low cost. The Greens are pushing for all this renters' rights stuff and, smash the kulaks and everything else. How is Labor going to get itself out of what looks like an increasing jam of its own making on housing?
I'm not sure. One way out of it might be to call a double dissolution election in which the Greens would hopefully be evaporated, eviscerated and wiped from the face of the planet, because they are a bunch of economic vandals, they're a bunch of economic Neanderthals and a bunch of knuckle draggers who should have no business having anything to do with the Treasury benches, let alone housing policy. But
this is why I love you, Joe.
Yes, that's right. We agree on many things, Holly. But the Housing Future Fund, it's capitalism, baby. It's capitalism at work. It's the exact same model as the Future Fund that I believe was designed by Peter Costello. Pretty sure he wasn't a socialist in the Labor Party. It was designed by Jason Clare, who is about as far on the right of the Labor Party and a sensible Labor Party as you can get. He's awesome. He's a super guy from southwest Sydney. And the idea is that, yes, you have this $10 billion sitting there on the stock market. We all know
off the books, too.
We all know
it's off the books. It's off the books. It's off the books. Holly, hang on, Joe. We're going to have to go to a break in a minute.
Money
Hollie Hughes, talk us through this Housing Australia Future Fund. And I don't know that it quite seems like the capitalism that Joe's talking about, because when you divide the number of houses it's supposed to get by the returns, it seems like they're going to be awfully cheap houses they're going to be building.
Yeah, it doesn't quite add up. And I mean, the fundamental thing that Labor doesn't seem to understand, and I mean, you could listen to many, many speeches, I'm sure in the reps, but certainly in the Senate, and particularly my favourite's when Paul Scar gets up with his economics book and he runs them through the basics of supply and demand. What we know about the housing market is it is supply issues that are the problem. It is state governments, and it's state governments and local governments with regards to land release, but then the ridiculous red and green tape that's tied up in them. And let's not forget some of the green tape that was just about to exist in WA around cultural heritage sites that Tanya Plibersek and the rest of them won't rule out if the voice comes in. And this was on 1,100 square metre, blocks. So you wanted to plant a new camellia, you had to get someone in because you couldn't go less, you couldn't go more than 50 centimetres down in the dirt. It's just all of this red tape, green tape, Indigenous tape, whatever you want to call it, is insane. Someone somewhere needs to grow up, and I got to tell you, James, and Joe, I'm going to say I feel for you here. The housing fund is a disaster. It is a stupid policy. It should go away. It's not a trigger for a double dissolution yet, and I don't think they'll pull it anyway. But it is not the solution to this. The solution is much more land release, making sure that we're developing many, many more areas. We have lots of areas. James, you and I are in Sydney. Joe, you're in Sydney. We all know, you go to a train station in Sydney, you go to some of these areas, there is a lot of scope to develop some of those areas into some high rises, mid rises, all of those things. But you go into NIMBYville because they can do it at the next station, but they're not going to do it at mine. Yeah. And this is what happens across the board. And someone somewhere needs to stand up like a grown-up. And this isn't federal government, in fact. This is actually
but hang on, that, Holly. You know that he's.
We're going to have to.
These people live here. We need to develop housing, and if we want our young people to be able to afford housing, we need more of it.
And that's, we're going to have to leave it there, guys. We're going to have
New South Wales Labor government is doing that.
And we should also, I think you bailed the cat on that. You bailed the cat on that, Hollie Hughes, because I think they also should maybe have a look at stop getting so addicted to the sugar hit of immigration to keep GDP going up while productivity goes down. But that's a discussion for another time, and I wish we could continue it. Thank you so much, Joe Hildebrand, Hollie Hughes.